Several years before the outbreak of the First World War, Belgium had already played a key role in the minds of German military leaders. They and many German statesmen and politicians were gripped by a fear of encirclement in the pre-war period. Due to increasing isolation in foreign policy, many Germans were strongly convinced that the German Empire was surrounded by hostile powers that denied it the recognition it deserved as a strong industrial, military and cultural nation. The German General Staff was particularly concerned about the Franco-Russian alliance, which had existed since 1894 and in which Paris and St. Petersburg promised each other mutual military support in case of an attack by Germany. In the event of a war, the German Empire would thus have had to contend with a war on two fronts, both in the east and in the west. In order to be prepared for this horror scenario, the German Chief of Staff, Alfred von Schlieffen, drew up a deployment plan in 1905, which we now know as the Schlieffen Plan. This plan envisaged that the majority of the German army would first march in a wide arc across Belgium and Luxembourg towards Paris and defeat the French army within just a few weeks. Before the Russian ally had even completed its mobilization and brought its troops to the front with its inefficient railway network, the German military would quickly be transferred to the east and defeated. The plan was daring and also extremely risky. This was because it assumed that the German army would simply advance without any problems and that there would be no active resistance from the Belgian or French armies. It is fair to say that the German military leadership at that time massively underestimated its opponents while grossly overestimating its own capabilities. In addition, they consciously accepted that they would violate Belgian neutrality, which Prussia and the other major European powers had been guaranteeing since 1839, and which would undoubtedly create further enemies. The mere fact that the Schlieffen Plan depended so heavily on the element of surprise and the speed of its execution was one of the main reasons why a last-minute agreement between the major powers to prevent a European war in summer of 1914 became impossible. After German mobilization was ordered on the 1st of August 1914, the army immediately set off westwards to occupy Luxembourg and Belgium as quickly as possible and could no longer be stopped. The military simply had no other plan to deal with this war on two fronts, which they considered to be absolutely inevitable. On the 2nd of August, Germany gave Belgium a 12-hour ultimatum. Either Belgium should allow German troops to march through its territory unhindered in return for later financial compensation, or it would have to bear all the consequences as an enemy nation. Brussels had already declared general mobilization a few days earlier and clearly stated that it would resist any violation of its neutrality by either Germany or France. Accordingly, the Belgian Crown Council rejected the German demands. Finally, on the 4th of August, German troops marched into Belgium and the disaster took its course. At first, everything seemed to be going according to plan for the German side. Mobilization was completed very quickly, and transport trains rolled westwards from Cologne every 10 minutes. However, the advance quickly stalled because the Belgian army and the local militia units, the Garde Civique, put up fierce resistance. The defensive fortifications also proved to be a tough nut to crack. The last fort of the Liège fortress did not surrender until after more than a week. In addition, logistical problems arose. The roads were congested with refugees and military convoys, and due to the destruction of the railway tracks, many of the urgently needed supplies now had to be brought to the front by horse-drawn carts. The prescribed marching pace of 30 kilometers per day proved to be an enormous imposition, and only after a few days the German soldiers were exhausted and hungry. They were frustrated and quickly responded to the unexpectedly high losses with brutal violence against the civilian population. They could not understand why the Belgian army defended itself so vehemently against the German Empire and fought a battle it could not win anyway. Rumours quickly spread about Belgian partisans who took up arms and waged a guerrilla war against the German occupation, carrying out ambushes, cutting off supply lines and inciting the population to revolt. This brought back memories of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871, in which irregular French troops, known as francs-tireurs, had spread terror and fear among German soldiers because they did not wear uniforms and usually attacked unexpectedly. In no time at all, horror stories spread about alleged Belgian atrocities such as mutilation or poisoning of German soldiers, and newspapers in Germany also began to report on such incidents. This led to a kind of psychosis that increasingly resulted in hasty acts of violence against the Belgian civilian population, for example in the small town of Frankfurt. On the 8th of August, a shot rang from a railway embankment. It is unclear exactly where it came from. The Germans suspected an assassination attempt by the inhabitants, while the inhabitants themselves insisted that a German soldier had accidentally fired the shot. In any case, Francochamps and several of its surrounding villages were set on fire and 14 men and women were shot. Francochamps was only one of many examples, however. In the very first week of the invasion, German soldiers had already consciously murdered hundreds of Belgian civilians. They had the explicit approval of the highest authorities, who deliberately did not stop these massacres. General Karl von Einem, for example, reported in a letter to his wife that the Belgian civilian population was carrying out treacherous night attacks on Germans and that he had ordered the destruction of all villages and the shooting of their inhabitants where such incidents took place. He had the backing of his superior, Karl von Bülow, who announced collective punishment for all villages in which individual inhabitants violated the rules of war. Even Kaiser Wilhelm II justified those atrocities in a private letter. The population of Belgium behaved in a diabolical, not to say bestial manner, not one iota better than the Cossacks. They tormented the wounded, beat them to death, killed doctors and medical orderlies, fired secretly on men harmlessly standing in the street. In fact, by pre-arranged signal under leadership. The King of the Belgians has to be notified at once that since his people have placed themselves outside of all observance of European customs, they will be treated accordingly. Conditions for Belgium will become immensely more difficult. Once the city of Liège had finally been completely captured, the German advance westwards was able to continue in mid-August of 1914. As the troops advanced towards the French border, the level of violence against the civilian population continued to increase, with panic over an attack by Belgian partisans still prevailing. This was evident, for example, in the small town of Vizé, which had actually been captured on the first day of the campaign. On the 15th of August, new German troops arrived in the town, indulged in drinking in the evening, and then heard shots that they claimed came from Belgian resistance fighters. In their frenzy, they marched through the town, shooting indiscriminately at civilians and setting the town on fire. By the end of the night, 23 people were dead, the city was a pile of rubble, and over 600 civilians had been deported to Germany for forced labour. A similar incident occurred in Liège itself when panic broke out among the occupying soldiers because Belgian civilians had allegedly fired at Germans from their homes, even though all weapons had already been confiscated by the military at that point. Reprisals were not long in coming, and in the end, 60 civilians were shot and 58 buildings in the city were looted and destroyed. The army then decided to blame around 400 Russian Jewish students at the University of Liège and deported them to a prison camp. A particularly horrific massacre took place in the town of Aarschot, which was occupied on the 19th of August. Upon arrival, the German soldiers were already extremely irritated due to the previous heavy fighting and behaved aggressively towards the local population. Then, in the evening, the commander of the 8th Brigade, Colonel Stenger, was shot dead. It is impossible to say for certain whether Stenger was shot by a Belgian civilian or whether he was accidentally killed by one of his own soldiers, but in any case, the entire population of Aarschot was blamed. A hunt began for alleged franc-tireurs who wanted to instigate an uprising in the town. The male inhabitants were rounded up, and a group of 76 people was escorted away and immediately executed. In the evening, the mayor, his son and his brother, as well as every third man still being held captive, were also shot. During the night, the town was looted, and in the weeks that followed, several hundred people were deported. A total of around 156 people died in Aarschot. But serious atrocities also took place further south, for example in the towns of Andenne and Say, both located on the Meuse River, which were occupied by German troops on the 19th and the 20th of August. Some German soldiers were shot on the very evening of their arrival. It is difficult to reconstruct exactly where these shots came from. Belgian sources reported that it was a case of friendly fire and that drunk German soldiers had accidentally shot their comrades, while German soldiers swore that they had been attacked by Belgian partisans, even though it was impossible for them to see any in the darkness of the night. In any case, German soldiers broke into numerous houses that evening and murdered their inhabitants. 56 in total. At 4 a.m. on the 21st of August, the local military command issued an order to the soldiers to search the towns for hidden weapons and ammunition. 20 people were shot on the spot during this operation, while 110 of those arrested were sentenced to death by a court-martial. That morning, the population of around 800 people was gathered in the Place de Tilleul, and the men were separated from the women and the children. Here too, suspects were singled out and executed, usually without any evidence that they had actually committed any crime. All in all, 262 people were executed during these days. An even greater crime was committed by German troops in Tamines on the 22nd of August. Tamines had been defended by French troops, who were very popular with the local population. When French soldiers ambushed a German patrol, the inhabitants cheered "Vive la Belgique, vive la France." This probably gave the Germans the firm impression that the civilians had participated in the defense of Tamines. After the French had withdrawn, the German soldiers herded the inhabitants into the local church and accused them of helping the French in their defense. The men were then led outside, taken to the nearby riverbank, accused of being francs-tireurs, and subsequently executed. A total of 383 people were killed that evening without any evidence of their guilt. However, the massacre with the highest number of civilian deaths took place in Dinant, a picturesque little town on the Meuse River. There the German army had been fired upon while crossing the Meuse, most likely by French soldiers on the opposite bank. In any case, the German troops, in their self-induced paranoia, were convinced that they had been fired upon by Belgian civilians. On the express orders of their superiors, the soldiers killed a total of 647 inhabitants of Dinant on the 23rd of August, including women, children, and the elderly. Numerous buildings in the town were also looted and set on fire. In the end, the once proud town of Dinant lay in ruins and was barely recognizable. There are no reports of any German soldiers protesting or resisting. A letter from a Saxon infantryman to his parents, written just a few days after the massacre, in which he described the events with pride and without any compassion, is almost shocking. The 25th of August, early morning. Dinant has fallen, everything burnt down. French fled. Everything, knapsacks, shirts, shoes, everything imaginable, rifles thrown away and fled. We are advancing further and further. The men are being shot, the houses looted and burnt down. Don't be afraid. Everything will be fine and we will see each other again soon. I am very happy, because our life is not remotely like that of robbers. The last atrocity we will look at today, namely the destruction of the venerable university city of Leuven, gained international notoriety. When the German army arrived in Leuven without resistance on the 19th of August, everything was calm at first. Nevertheless, the atmosphere remained tense as rumours of the atrocities in Liège and Aarschot quickly spread. However, when the Belgian army launched a counterattack from Antwerp on the 25th of August and broke through the German lines in several places near Leuven, the situation changed abruptly. Some German units withdrew to Leuven in the evening, whereupon a shootout broke out, perhaps because German soldiers had fired on their comrades in the darkness. In any case, the Germans almost reflexively suspected the beginning of a Belgian popular uprising, which, together with the Belgian counteroffensive, was supposed to bring about the liberation of the city. Soldiers broke into houses, murdered the inhabitants, and then set them on fire. Around midnight, German soldiers broke into the university library and set it on fire with petrol. Almost all of the holdings, many of them priceless works from the medieval ages, were lost. Other important buildings in the city were also set on fire. The murder and destruction continued until the 28th of August, i.e. for another 3 days. Most of the inhabitants of Leuven were forcibly expelled to the surrounding villages, and around 1,500 of them were deported to Germany, where they had to remain in an army camp until 1915. In the end, 248 people were dead, and a sixth of the city was destroyed. So, now that I have listed more than enough terrible crimes, it is time to sum them up. It is difficult to imagine and comprehend the full extent of the atrocities committed by the German army in Belgium in the summer and autumn of 1914. But because they have been studied so thoroughly by historians, we now know many of these incidents in vivid detail and can form a greater picture. According to calculations, there were 484 incidents during the German invasion of Belgium that resulted in at least one civilian casualty. A total of 5,521 people died. Tens of thousands of buildings were deliberately destroyed or burnt down. The rape of Belgian women was widespread, although no exact figures are available, as it is always difficult to exactly count cases of sexual violence. Hundreds of thousands of people fled, seeking refuge in the Netherlands, France, or Great Britain. The Rape of Belgium, as this series of war crimes was called by the Allies already during the war, left the Belgian population with tremendous trauma that remained in the public memory for a very long time. It is striking that the acts of violence were systematic and committed throughout the entire German army and cannot be attributed to just a few violent units. In fact, the various German armies had very similar number of victims, with none standing out too much in particular. Of the approximately 300 German regiments, an estimated 150 were involved in significant acts of violence against civilians, resulting in over 10 deaths. Before we continue with this analysis, I would like to briefly clarify that crimes against the civilian population in 1914 were not exclusive to the German army in Belgium. The Russian and Austro-Hungarian militaries, for example, also took brutal action against civilians whom they accused of being hostile towards them. For example, during its brief occupation of East Prussia, the Tsarist army rampaged through the region, devastating entire villages and murdering around 1,500 people. The Russian actions in Galicia and Bukovina were no less brutal. During its invasion, the army targeted Germans, Poles, pro-Austrian Ukrainians and Jews, deporting thousands of them to the Russian heartland. The sad climax was the pogrom in Lemberg, Lvov or Lviv, where Cossacks marched through the Jewish quarters and killed around 20 Jews. Further south, the troops of the Habsburg monarchy cracked down hard on the Serbian civilian population, whom they regarded as aggressive and combative due to long-held stereotypes. In one incident in Szabadz, between 100 and 200 unarmed men, women and children were locked in a church and then murdered. The fact that such atrocities against civilians occurred on 3 different fronts at the same time says a lot about the dynamics and nature of the First World War. We can see that with the shift towards more total forms of warfare in which ever larger parts of a given population were involved, it became increasingly difficult to distinguish combatants from non-combatants, and the male civilian population in particular was suspected of secretly working with the enemy. Brutal acts of violence were then made possible by the absolute obedience demanded within the army towards superiors, the nerve-wracking reality of war, and the unquestioned belief that, in an emergency, violence against innocent people was justified. What differentiated the German conduct in Belgium from the atrocities committed by others wasn't so much the scale of its brutality, but rather how extremely widespread the belief that a massive civilian underground movement existed that needed to be cracked down at all costs. This brings us to the attempt to explain the reasons behind the German atrocities against the Belgian population in more detail. One explanation that is repeatedly put forward in some studies focuses on the allegedly uniquely brutal and ruthless military culture of Prussia and the German Empire. It emphasizes that during their campaign in Belgium, German soldiers displayed strong anti-Catholicism, hyper-nationalism, and social Darwinism due to their upbringing in a nationalistic and authoritarian system, all of which then erupted with full force in predominantly Catholic Belgium. This thesis, which emphasizes supposed German peculiarities, is baseless for the simple reason that, as I've already mentioned, comparable atrocities were committed at the same time by Russian and Austro-Hungarian troops. Apart from that, however, the alleged anti-Catholicism of the Germans cannot have played a major role, since troops from majorly Catholic areas in Germany also participated in atrocities against the Belgian civilian population. The sometimes cited hyper-nationalism and social Darwinism, which made the Belgian civilian population appear inferior in the eyes of the soldiers, does not serve as a satisfactory explanation either. The Germans did not wreak nearly as much havoc on the Eastern Front in Poland as they did in Belgium, even though some crimes were committed against the civilian population there as well, for example in Kalisz in 1914. Finally, the explanation that the traditionally dominant position of the German military over the civil authorities ensured that it could act without interference is not believable. The claim that the army abused the lack of oversight and always resorted to particularly extreme and brutal methods, which sometimes even led to the extermination of entire ethnic groups such as the Herero and Nama in German Southwest Africa in 1904, simply lacks plausibility. Because as brutal as the army's actions against perceived Belgian resistance fighters were, they did not last long and were already over by the autumn of 1914, even though the final military success was still elusive and the war continued. The subsequent German occupation of Belgium was harsh, but it cannot be said that the military took merciless action to bring about its goals of a final victory. Overall, the unique cultural characteristics attributed to the Germans by some scholars cannot explain why the war crimes in Belgium happened. But what were the actual reasons then? The main explanation is that the invading German armies were gripped by a collective fear that the Belgian civilian population had joined forces and formed a mass resistance movement. An almost pathological paranoia developed within the German army about alleged francs-tireurs, which often led to hasty and panicky reactions. This paranoia stemmed from the Franco-Prussian War, when German troops actually had to fight French guerrilla fighters and was then transferred to the current situation. The direct trigger for the war crimes in 1914 was usually unexpected shots or an explosion from an unknown source. Depending on the case, these could have been scattered Belgian soldiers, members of the Garde Civique, drunk or disoriented German soldiers, or perhaps even Belgian resistance fighters. In any case, the Germans almost always believed that they were in an enemy ambush and punished the civilian population present in response. Added to this was the frustration over the invasion of Belgium not going according to plan and the strong aversion of the German officers to any interference by the civilian population in this war. It is the scientific consensus that the Belgian mass resistance was not much more than a figment of the imagination and never actually existed. The historians Alan Kramer and John Horn also come to this conclusion in their 2001 work German Atrocities 1914, A History of Denial, which is now considered the standard work on this subject. They too argue that it was paranoia that led to the massacres in Dinant, Leuven and Liège, and that although there were certainly some cases of Belgian resistance fighters, there was no Belgian national uprising. They also argue that the German army leadership deliberately fueled these fears by instructing soldiers from the outset to expect civilian resistance and to punish it severely. In doing so, they contributed greatly to the emergence of this psychosis and also consciously accepted that innocent people would be killed. Kramer and Horn also argue that this paranoia was able to develop in the German army because the elites in the army had for decades harbored a deep aversion to any kind of independent people's army that could potentially take on revolutionary traits and undermine the traditional social foundations supported by the upper classes. Thus, the German crimes were primarily based on a self-created fantasy construct. However, Horn's and Kramer's work has not been without criticism. It has been noted by historian Peter Hoeres that the authors based their arguments almost uncritically on the findings of the Belgian and French commissions of inquiry, and in some cases unquestioningly accept sensationalist reports of German crimes in contemporary French newspapers at face value. On the other hand, they seem to disregard the few available accounts of German officers and soldiers that were still available after the extensive destruction of the Second World War and use them merely to attribute war crimes to the respective military units. All references in these German documents to Belgian atrocities, francs-tireurs or illegal acts of war are consistently dismissed and attributed to a delusional image fed by the Franco-Prussian War. The art historian Ulrich Keller attempted to rectify this injustice by taking a closer look at the statements made by German soldiers stored in the Federal Archives in Berlin in his book Schuldfragen, or Questions of Guilt in English, published in 2017. In doing so, he fundamentally questioned the research consensus and claimed that there cannot be any doubt about the existence of organized Belgian guerrilla movement. Keller's intention was by no means to justify or to downplay the crimes committed by German troops, but rather to show that the Belgian civilian population was by no means entirely innocent, and that some of the reprisals were provoked by the resistance. His aim was to write a shared history of suffering and to portray the First World War as a space that generated violence and even harsher counter-violence. For example, he presented it as a completely proven fact that German troops were continuously victims of Belgian ambushes in the days leading up to the capture of Dinant, which culminated in the worst massacre of the summer of 1914, and were brutally tortured to death by Belgian guerrilla fighters. He came to this conclusion because he relied heavily on German reports that told of the discovery of German soldiers' bodies that had been charred, had their eyes gouged out, or had their throats cut. Keller writes, "These are actual war crimes, proven beyond doubt by multiple sources, which cannot be dismissed as propaganda fairy tales. It is therefore clear that cruel and abhorrent Franc-Tireur resistance, in italics in the original, contributed to the bloody actions of the German armed forces in Dinant." And later, looking at the Belgian Franc-Tireur war as a whole, one can venture the assumption that if it had not taken place, much bloodshed and a century-long debate about guilt would have been avoided, without the outcome of the first 4 weeks of the war having been significantly different. It may come as no surprise that Schuldfragen was heavily criticised. Benjamin Ziemann from the University of Sheffield criticizes Keller for relying unconditionally on the statements of German soldiers without questioning them in any great detail or subjecting them to proper source criticism. He ignores other sources. Furthermore, the almost polemical tone of the work is criticized, as is Keller's description of the organized Belgian Franc-Tireur warfare as an undisputed fact without providing any concrete evidence for this. As controversial as Schuldfragen may have been, the findings could not simply be ignored, and so in 2017 a group of historians gathered at a conference in Potsdam to discuss the possibility of a Belgian underground war. Although no agreement was reached, it became clear that the question of just how widespread Belgian resistance was during World War I is far from being fully answered, and that it will probably remain with us for a few more years to come. The military historian, Sönke Neitzel, who himself participated in the conference, said in an interview, "In my opinion, Keller has shown that there was much more comprehensive resistance by so-called Franc-Tireurs in Belgium than we previously thought, and that this is one of the several important explanations for the German acts of violence. I am not convinced by the extent of the Franc-Tireur war that Keller describes in his book. Whether there really was such organised cooperation between the Franc-Tireur and the Belgian army seems doubtful to me. I believe more in spontaneous actions, more than described in the book by Horn and Kramer, but probably not to the extent described by Keller. This needs to be investigated in more detail, and the German sources compared with the Belgian ones." Whatever the actual reasons may have been, the crimes committed by the Germans against the Belgians were horrific, and news of the increasingly terrible atrocities quickly reached the British capital. As you surely know, the German invasion of Belgium was the official reason why Great Britain entered the war on the side of the Entente on the 4th of August 1914. However, Belgium was little more than a pretext for the British cabinet, as London's primary concern was not to antagonise Russia, with whom it had shared a bitter rivalry for dominance in Central Asia throughout the late 19th century until the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. If Great Britain had remained neutral in this conflict, St. Petersburg would certainly have considered it a betrayal, and after a victory over Germany, would have threatened the British Empire once again as an even stronger rival. On the other hand, the British cabinet also wanted to prevent an increase in power on the European continent in favour of the German Empire. Regardless of who would emerge as the victor, it was of enormous importance for Britain to enter the war on the side of France and Russia. The Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, therefore insisted on immediate entry into the war. However, the cabinet also knew that the British population would be unlikely to rally behind the noble goal of preserving British national interests, especially since the conflict had begun in the far distant Balkans. The violation of Belgium's neutrality came at just the right moment, because now Germany clearly was the undisputed aggressor that had to be stopped. When reports of German atrocities reached London, they had an excellent propaganda vehicle that could be exploited. And so the British press got to work. Although the German crimes against the Belgian civilian population were bad enough and needed no exaggeration, even reputable newspapers embellished the atrocities with horrific details or simply invented some more. After the destruction of Leuven, or the Belgian Oxford, as the city was known in Britain, they reported on the indiscriminate slaughter of children, women and priests by soldiers, the mass rape of Belgian women, and claimed without proof that the Germans were systematically chopping off the hands of Belgian children. The motif of severed children's hands and feet remained a constant theme in British propaganda, although it is somewhat ironic that this very motif had originated 2 decades earlier when the British press had denounced Belgian crimes in the Congo, where mutilation of the local population was a common punishment. Anyway, the most prominent protagonist in this propaganda campaign was Alfred Harmsworth, a media mogul who had taken over the market leadership for newspapers in Great Britain in the late 19th century. He mostly achieved this by buying as many newspapers as he could and by publishing a new type of newspaper, the tabloid, which was inexpensive and stood out with sensational headlines and numerous illustrations. This category also included the Daily Mail, founded by Harmsworth in 1896, with which he contributed greatly to making the world a worse place to live in. Be that as it may, in 1908 he also bought the London Times, thus entering the more serious press landscape. Harmsworth was one of the most prominent advocates of the war against Germany and used his newspapers to try to stir up belligerence amongst the British population. In addition, the shamelessly stylized portrayal of German atrocities in Belgium attracted high profits through higher sales figures. It was the London Times that first used the word Huns on the 29th of August 1914 to describe the Germans, referring to the infamous speech given by Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1900 at the farewell ceremony for the German China Corps sent to suppress the Boxer Rebellion. Harmsworth also had a lasting influence on the image of the spiked helmet-wearing German butcher who arbitrarily spread suffering and destruction across the country. Germany had little recourse against this flood of British propaganda, and desperate attempts to spread rumours about Allied crimes failed miserably. This was partly because the German crimes in Belgium could hardly be played down, and partly because the British press enjoyed an excellent reputation internationally. London was the media capital of the world, where almost all communication channels converged. British newspapers were considered balanced, independent, and above all, free from state censorship and therefore reliable. Accordingly, there was a growing nervousness within the government in London that the web of lies spun by the press through unfounded reports could one day collapse and permanently ruin the good reputation of the British press and the state. Therefore, in September 1914, the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, ordered the establishment of a commission to investigate and prove the German crimes in Belgium. The Committee on Alleged German Outrages, led by the respected lawyer and historian James Bryce, compiled a 360-page brochure known as the Bryce Report, based on statements from 1,200 Belgian refugees. The report was translated into 30 languages and published at an extremely opportune moment, namely on the 12th of May 1915, just 5 days after the sinking of the Lusitania by a German submarine. The report was a bestseller, especially in the United States, and contributed greatly to the formation of widespread anti-German sentiment. The fact that the sources at that time were highly unreliable and that none of the witnesses were named, allegedly to protect their relatives still living in Belgium, did not harm the popularity of the booklet. Now, the German government had to respond and clear its army's name. In November 1914, Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg visited the destroyed town of Leuven and promised the residents that the matter would be investigated. However, it took repeated pressure before the Prussian War Ministry was finally persuaded to launch the necessary investigations. The Military Investigation Office, set up for violations of the laws of war, continued to base its defense on the thesis that the Belgian Franc-Tireurs were resisting in violation of international law. The German side considered the participation of Belgian civilians in the defense of their homeland to be a violation of the Hague Convention of 1907, i.e. a war crime that could be punished accordingly. However, when questioning witnesses, the investigating officers found that the thesis of mass Belgian resistance was untenable and that there was little evidence of Belgian atrocities against German wounded soldiers. Instead, many witness statements confirmed that the German excesses were unprovoked and a clear overreaction. Before the publication of the German White Book in May 1915, numerous passages that would have pointed to friendly fire were ultimately deleted. The White Book was unconvincing and failed to exonerate the German army. For example, the massacre at Tammin was not even mentioned, as no exonerating material could even be found. A Grey Book, published by the Belgian government in exile in 1916, finally refuted most of the German arguments. A key reason for why German propaganda failed to gain traction internationally was the absolute lack of imagination within the German military and its inability to understand that in modern mass societies, it is emotions, dramatic stories, and clear perpetrator-victim confrontations that shape public opinion. This is illustrated by the case of Edith Cavell, a British nurse who was working in Belgium when the war broke out. From her hospital in Brussels, she helped 200 Belgian men flee across the Dutch border, from where they could rejoin the Belgian army and continue the fight. In August of 1915, Cavell was finally caught and sentenced to death for crimes against the German armed forces. A plea for mercy from the American ambassador in Brussels was rejected, and Cavell was shot on the 12th of October 1915. Although the German military leadership was, for once, in the right, and Cavell had indeed violated military law, her death was portrayed in the British press as an inhumane act against a poor English girl, and she herself was revered as a heroine and a martyr. However, when French troops executed 3 German nurses for espionage in 1915 and 1916, there was no such outrage on the part of the German propaganda. When a perplexed American journalist asked the press officer in charge at army headquarters, Walter Nicolai, for the reasons, he replied, "Why protest against it? After all," he explained, "the German nurses had indeed been spies, and the French had every right to shoot them." Let us now jump forward a few years in time to Paris in 1919. Germany had been defeated and was now a democracy. The victorious powers were now discussing the restructuring of post-war Europe. The Allies agreed that, in view of the extensive destruction in Belgium and northern France and the war crimes committed in 1914 by the German army, it was not enough to simply talk about war suffering and the right of the stronger. Those responsible must be held accountable for their violations of international law. The delegates from France, Belgium and Great Britain in particular argued for the criminal prosecution of German perpetrators, politicians and military personnel alike. The final Treaty of Versailles ultimately provided in Article 227 for the former Kaiser, Wilhelm II, who had fled to Holland, to be publicly arraigned for a supreme offence against international morality and the sanctity of treaties. He was primarily charged with violating Belgian neutrality. Furthermore, Article 228 granted the Allies the right to bring before military tribunals persons accused of having committed acts in violation of the laws and customs of war. In Germany, these articles were widely regarded as a violation of national sovereignty. And so in December of 1919, the Weimar National Assembly passed the Law on the Prosecution of War Crimes and War Offences. In it, they placed the prosecution of war criminals solely in the hands of the Leipzig Imperial Court, in the hopes of exonerating the accused and refuting the allegations made against Germany. In 1920, the Allies finally handed the German government an extradition list of 800 names. However, the extradition was not carried out, and no trials concerning German war atrocities took place during the Leipzig trials between 1921 and 1922. Of the more than 800 people initially accused, only 45 were convicted, and only 10 of them were sentenced to prison. Although the judges were interested in legally correct proceedings and proper evidence, there could be no question of justice being served here. The Belgian government agreed with this assessment, as the first case brought by Belgium in Leipzig was promptly dismissed by the judges. The Belgian delegation then left the court proceedings in indignation, describing the trial as a travesty of justice. The Inter-Allied Commission described the Leipzig trials as highly unsatisfactory, and France insisted on the forceful extradition of the German criminals. However, due to British resistance, the French government under Raymond Poincaré had to abandon extradition and instead content itself with sentencing German war criminals in absentia. The Belgian government followed suit, but Germany flatly refused to extradite the convicted men. For example, in May 1925, 7 generals were found guilty by the Belgian court-martial for the massacre at Dinant. Colonel Johann Meister was accused of the systematically inhumane conduct of his troops and of giving the order to execute civilians. On the grounds that German troops at Dinant had allegedly been fired upon by Belgian civilians, the court in Leipzig dismissed the charges and stated that there was no evidence to show that the execution was unlawful, nor could it be proved that the defendant issued an order to shoot the civilians. The 6 other generals were also found not guilty by the court in Leipzig. Those responsible for the atrocities in Belgium in 1914 thus went completely unpunished. Before I end this video, I would like to recommend a great YouTube channel to you. It's called Historie Italiae, and it's run by my mate Alessandro, who studies at the University of Naples. His first video is an incredible 2-hour documentary about the Italian Renaissance, which spans from the collapse of the Roman Empire to the beginning of the Italian Wars, and as someone who isn't really familiar with that time period, I could say that I learnt a great deal from it. It's excellently researched, wonderfully written, and has been put together with so much effort and passion that it makes me look lazy in comparison. Like, he even composed half of the background music himself and commissioned an actual artist to hand-draw the scenes at the beginning of each chapter, which is just insane, quite frankly. So, I'd really appreciate it if you checked out his video and showed him some love for all the work he's put in. He absolutely deserves it. You'll find a link to his channel in the description, so please check it out. Now, before I say goodbye, I just wanted to let you know that I do have a Patreon account where you can help me make more videos in the future if you have the means to do so. In exchange, you'll get access to a Patreon exclusive Discord server and, depending on your tier, some other benefits like early access to my videos, for example. In any case, I want to give a special shout out to my biggest supporters, without whom this wouldn't be possible. Marius Gerling, Leader Titan, Der dicke Flipper, Ich liebe Emden und Groningen, Defender, Tochtli, A Cup of Tea, Tristan Kriegsmann, Ryan Layton, Celestia, the Grand Duke of Sealand, Luca Drole, Wienweh, Pseudoriser, Lal Furphy, Yin, Big Dave, Folling, Turd Hambone, and Johnny No Cash. I'm extremely grateful for your support. Have a very nice day, and see you next time.